Hello and welcome to China Now. I am Stanley Kwabla Arku, your host. Today's edition features China Currents with Kris, followed by two insightful conversations in our Thinkers Forum segment, from corporate drama in China to global diplomacy and bold ideas on innovation and power politics. Now, first up, China Currents, our weekly look at China's most compelling developments. Now, Kris will take us through five fascinating stories. A dramatic succession battle shaking one of China's beverage giants, Nvidia's diplomatic courtship of Chinese tech circles, a trio of foreign ministers visiting Beijing, a flavorful delivery to China's space station, and robots catching the metro to work. Over to you, Kris.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. In this episode, China's beverage titan embroiled in succession battle. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang's public courtship of Chinese audiences. Foreign ministers of Iran, India, and Russia make successive visits to China. 6.5 tons of cargo arrives at China's space station, including 1.5 tons of Chinese cuisine. 41 Chinese robots commute to work via subway. I'm Kris. Now let's start today's China Currents. China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Last week, Wahaha Group, a Chinese beverage giant founded 38 years ago with annual revenue exceeding 70 billion yuan, around $10 billion, made headlines with its dramatic succession battle. More than a year after the death of its founder, once the richest man in China, Zhong Qingho, three of his children, until now unknown to the public, have taken the company's current chairwoman Kelly Zhong Qingho's daughter and designated heir to court. Each is demanding $700 million from what they claim is a trust fund their father set up for them, along with a share of Wahaha's equity that Kelly inherited. Mr. Zhong Qingho was long admired as a patriotic and humble entrepreneur, known for his preference for cloth shoes and inexpensive trains. It was widely publicized that he had only one marriage and doted on his only one daughter, Kelly. Those narratives are now being challenged. According to various sources, Zhong's three children, his public secret, are all US citizens, which adds another layer of intrigue against the backdrop of today's China-US relations. The eldest, Jackie Zhong, is 36 and works at Wahaha for years. Their mother is said to be a senior Wahaha executive, owning assets estimated at 5 billion yuan tied to the company. Following the dispute, Chinese netizens combed through past interviews with Zhong and Kelly in search of clues, spinning multiple theories around this family drama. One camp views it as a daughter's revenge tale. They see Kelly as a victim of conservative family traditions, highlighted by the rumor that Kelly's guardian while she was studying in the US was her father's pregnant mistress at the time. Proponents of this narrative interpret Kelly Zhong's reportedly frequent changes of drivers and maids, as well as installation of surveillance cameras throughout her house after she returned to China, as signs of a loss of trust towards those closest to her, including her father. They also see Kelly Zhong's business reform following the passing of her father, including the closure of 23 factories, some reportedly managed by her father's former mistress, a move to consolidate her own control over the conglomerate and push out her siblings. Another camp see this drama as a power struggle between two generations of entrepreneurs. They point to past exchanges between father and daughter as evidences of a rivalry of management philosophy. Kelly advocated for e-commerce, but her father dismissed the idea, saying people will have to shop in supermarkets. Kelly championed young hires and performance-based valuation, where Zhong relied on family connections and seniority-based incentives. The clash reached its peak when Kelly was hit with a wave of lawsuits and public criticism from Wahaha's veterans, including her uncle, when she overhauled the company's personnel, suppliers, marketing strategy, and budgeting. It seems Kelly's strategies paid off, with Wahaha's 2024 beverage sales rising 53% year-on-year to a record of 72.8 billion yuan, the highest in a decade, validating her vision for the modern era. Beyond the family drama, many Chinese are also concerned about the state asset dilution. Like many Chinese companies born during China's reform and opening period in the 1980s, Wahaha has a complex history of engagement with state-owned companies and state-funded entities. Wahaha reportedly still has half of its assets held by the state. Naturally, this has sparked speculation. Could a victory of Kelly Zhong's American siblings lead to an outflow of China's state assets? Some have reported the issue to authorities, prompting local government to establish a special investigation team. Commentators say Wahaha is just one of the many Chinese companies that had weathered through the same historical tides. All now stand at a crossroad, choosing a successor that can adapt to new consumer norms while modernizing a loyalty-based firm. And so much for the inheritance battle that touches on a larger theme of patriotism and feminism. Next up, the world's most valuable company, AI chipmaker Nvidia, and its CEO, Jensen Huang. A week after arriving in Beijing, Huang has already demonstrated his eagerness for the Chinese market. Last week, Huang attended the China International Supply Chain Expo. It was his third visit to China this year, surpassing even Apple's Tim Cook and Tesla's Elon Musk, despite Nvidia being restricted from selling AI chips to China since Trump's first term. Since April, Nvidia's core China business, namely the H20 chip, was temporarily halted by the US government, with estimated losses of at least $5.5 billion for Nvidia, according to Huang. And Huang did not hold back in his efforts at impressing the Chinese, though some media outlets teased him by asking, "What's the point of coming since chip sales are banned?" And here's the timeline of Huang's headline-making activities in China. July 14, a photo of Huang next to Xiaomi CEO Lei Jun went viral on Chinese internet. Lei is one of China's most popular tech entrepreneurs. July 15th, Huang dropped two bombshell announcements in his interview with China Central Television that Nvidia has received US government approval to sell H20 chips to China, and Nvidia will launch the RTX Pro GPU aimed at computer graphics, digital twins, and AI design. July 16th, Huang swapped his signature leather jacket for a traditional Chinese outfit and delivered his first ever speech in Chinese at CISCE. In Beijing, Huang spared no flattery. He praised every potential Nvidia customer, hailed China's supply chain, and cast Nvidia as a humble partner eager to earn its place. Considering Nvidia's competition, it must have felt like a race against time for Huang. In the US, soon after Nvidia announced H20 approval, rival AMD confirmed approval to export the MI308 chip. Like the H20, the MI308 is an AI accelerator designed specifically for China. In China, years of US restrictions shrank Nvidia's market share from 95% to 50%. Local Chinese chip makers used it as an opportunity to develop budget Nvidia replacement. Cambricon posted a loss of 8 straight years, and this year Q1 revenue jumped 42-fold and turned profitable. Huawei's Ascend chips are in high demand, and its latest Ascend 910C already delivered 80% of Nvidia's flagship H100's computing power. In April, Huawei linked 384 Ascend 910C cards into servers that outperform Nvidia's top-tier GB200 NVL72, though at 4 times the power consumption, a trade-off Chinese customers apparently accepted. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent weighed in on the issue on July 15th, saying China now produces chips on par with H20, so Nvidia should be allowed to sell. Though Jensen Huang's courtship felt like a spa treatment to the Chinese audiences, Chinese tech media outlet Chaping warned that now is the most perilous moment for domestic graphic card ecosystems, as it will be a psychological test for Chinese scientists who are aimed not only to catch up to the US, but winning the US-China tech competition. Next, Chinese diplomacy. Beijing recently hosted back-to-back visits from the foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, and India. On July 13th, Mr. Sergei Lavrov from Russia arrived in Beijing, where he was warmly hosted by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Lavrov later met with President Xi Jinping as Putin's envoy. Wang described Sino-Russian relations as the most stable, mature, and strategically significant major country relationship today. A noticeable contrast to his comments after meeting US Secretary of State Rubio, which were described as positive, pragmatic, and constructive. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi traveled to Tianjin on July 16th. Foreign Minister Wang Yi discussed Iran's nuclear dossier and reaffirmed China's respect for Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy. Last but not least, India's External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar came and met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi as well as Chinese Vice President Han Zheng. Jin Sanrong, a prominent scholar of international relations in China, expressed cautious optimism, remarking that India's mindset and strategy of viewing China as its real rival won't easily change overnight. Next, a special delivery between Earth and space. On July 15th, China launched the Tianzhou 9 cargo spacecraft, delivering 6.5 tons of supplies to the Tiangong space station. The payload includes 1.5 tons of Chinese-style food, mapo tofu, tomato scrambled eggs, braised water chestnut, vegetarian stir-fry lotus root, kami potatoes, and the astronauts requested apples. The total types of cuisines on the station now exceed 190. They also brought two next-gen extravehicular suits, extending spacewalks from 15 to 20 EVAs, and extending suit lifespan from 3 to 4 years. A core gym device for counteracting microgravity was included in the shipment, and 23 scientific instruments spanning life science, biotech, material science, and combustion studies. The mission aims to deepen understanding of the physiology under microgravity and support human health research. And let's switch gears to some everyday tech innovations in Shenzhen. Last Monday, 41 delivery robots began their subway commute to replenish convenience stores. They ride elevators, enter platforms and trains, and then deliver goods to over 100 7-Eleven stores across the city. On the first day of work, they were swarmed by subway passengers eager to snap selfies with them. Store managers say traditional restocking is inefficient. Trucks drive from street to station, unload and staff carry goods to the store, often hitting delays or parking issues. A single restocking could take 2 hours. Now it's up to the 41 robots to cover peak season demand in every Shenzhen Metro, 7-Eleven, and optimize off-peak deliveries. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below. And see you next time.
Now, in our first Thinkers Forum, we explore Australia's strategic balancing acts in an increasingly multipolar Asia. What does the return of President Donald Trump mean for US engagement in the region? How is Canberra navigating the pressures of alliance and autonomy? We'll hear a critical perspective on shifting power dynamics and Australia's evolving role in the Indo-Pacific.
I think that depends on how the US-China relationship evolves, how intense the strategic rivalry becomes, and also on how strongly committed Australia is to supporting the United States. Now, I think on the first issue, I do think there are signs of concern. I think, for example, under the Biden administration, I think we saw escalating rivalry between the US and China, a more intense strategic contest between them, growing concerns about, for example, clashes over Taiwan. How difficult a problem that is for Australia to manage in future will depend a lot on how that develops. My own view is that under the Trump administration, despite some aggressive language from, for example, Secretary of State Pete Hegseth at the Shangri-La Dialogue earlier this year, I think the Trump administration is less committed to sustaining America's position in East Asia, more willing to contemplate an accommodation with China, and therefore I think in the longer term we may see a lessening of that kind of rivalry, which I think will make it easier for Australia to manage its positioning between the US and China. Likewise, I do think that partly because of the conduct of the Trump administration, its fairly unsympathetic attitude towards allies, its doubts, for example, about important features of the US-Australia strategic relationship like Orcus, I think the tendency in Australia, the willingness of Australia to back the United States against China will decline somewhat as the policy making out of Washington becomes more erratic. And we've seen evidence of this recently. For example, in Mr. Albanese's given a speech last weekend in which he spoke a lot about Australia's independence. And I think he was referring there in a guarded way to his desire for Australia to chart a different path from America in its dealings with the region, including with China. So I think on both of those aspects, the US-China aspect and the Australia-US aspect, I think the capacity for Australia to manage the tensions, the inherent tensions in the significance of its relationship with China as an economic partner and with America as a strategic partner, I think that's going to become, if anything, a little bit easier in the years ahead. I think when we look at the long historical pattern in the last 10 years or even longer, I do think it's very clear that the distribution of wealth and power has shifted very strongly China's way. China's economic growth, of course, its development as a technological power, its developments as a military power, including, of course, its very significant expansion of air and maritime capabilities, the strengthening of its diplomatic position in Southeast Asia, for example, I think the overall sort of approach that China has taken has put it in a much stronger position than the United States. I think the United States, for example, in its protectionist policies, has tended to alienate many Southeast Asian countries. And I think its relative neglect of the region, its failure to really respond effectively to China's growing military strength means that China is now in a better position than it was a decade ago to contest America's position as a leading power in the region. And I think that's, in the long term, it's a significant factor in Australia's evolving attitude towards its future place in Asia. I think China's capacity to prevail in a US-China war over Taiwan has grown very significantly as its air and maritime forces in particular have developed a lot in recent years. I think America has responded very sluggishly to that challenge. I think America has failed to take the steps that would be necessary to preserve the advantage that it used to enjoy over the PLA in the kind of capabilities and operations that will be involved in a Taiwanese contingency. I therefore think that there's a declining capacity of the United States effectively to deter China from taking military action over Taiwan, or for that matter, in the event of a crisis in the South China Sea, for example. I do think that is a sort of fundamental principle of power politics, that the less likely you are to win a conflict, the harder it is to convince your potential adversary that you're willing to fight it, and therefore the less effective your deterrent posture is going to be. I think we also need to add to that the nuclear dimension. I think for a long time, US policymakers and strategists tended to overlook the significance of China's nuclear capabilities as a factor in US decision making about whether or not to go to Taiwan's defense. And I think there's a significant increase in understanding now in the United States that a Taiwan contingency could escalate to a nuclear war, and that in a nuclear war, the costs and risks to America would be much, much higher than they would be in a conventional war. The potential, of course, for attacks on the US homeland. And I think both the development of China's own nuclear capabilities in recent years and the prospects for further developments in the years ahead, and the lessons of the Ukraine crisis, which I think have been very significant in reaffirming the significance of nuclear weapons in contemporary power politics. I think both of those factors have meant that, quite apart from the shifting conventional balance I mentioned, I think the nuclear balance is also a very significant part of that. I therefore think that the US deterrent posture in relation to China over issues like Taiwan has weakened significantly and will continue to do so in the years ahead. I think the reality is that if you look at the raw calculus of power, we are already living in a multipolar world, and indeed in a multipolar region. Globally, the idea that the United States would be the unchallengeably dominant power across the globe, which appeared in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, that idea is past. We now live in a world in which there are a number of major centers of power. America, of course, is still one of them. China is one. India, I think, is one. Russia is one. And I think Europe, too, is increasingly becoming a major pole in its own right. And so I think we're living in a multipolar world, and I think we need to accept that and learn to live with it. I think we're also living in a multipolar Asia. I think in East Asia and the Western Pacific, China is already the strongest power by far, but there are other important powers in East Asia and the Western Pacific, including, of course, Japan. And of course, in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region, we have India as a major player, a great power, I think, in its own right. So I think we'll see in future an Asia, in fact, we're already seeing, I think, an Asia which is essentially divided between what we might call primarily a Chinese and an Indian sphere of influence, but with other significant powers, as I say, Japan, but I think also Indonesia in future as its economy grows, which it very likely will. So the question is, I think that's the reality. The question is, can that multipolar order, both at the global and at the regional level, be managed peacefully? I think it can be. So I'm an optimist in that respect. I think there's a real prospect that as a region, we can find a way to recognize the strong position of the great powers, but also find a way for smaller and middle powers like Australia to have their own place in the region, to have their own say, to be able to protect their interests, to be able to work constructively with one another and with the great powers. There are plenty of examples of history of these kind of multipolar orders working like that. The challenge, I think, for us in Asia is to focus on the task of ensuring that the multipolar strategic order that we're living in can be managed peacefully and in a way that ensures the prosperity of countries across the region. I do think the era of US primacy in Asia is over. I think that's past. I think the question we face now is whether or not the US will continue to play some lesser but still significant role in Asia, or whether it will play no role at all. Now, I think of many countries in the region, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, I think certainly, would prefer to see the United States remain in Asia in a kind of a balancing role so that it contributes as one of the poles in that multipolar regional order. And for example, that's what our foreign minister, Penny Wong, refers to when she talks about a region in which no country dominates and no country is dominated. And she talks about the United States contributing to a balance of power in Asia. Now, I think that would be a desirable outcome. I think Asia would be easier to build the kind of stable multipolar order in Asia, which worked for countries throughout the region if the United States continued to contribute. But I don't think we should take it for granted that it will. I think the fact is that the costs to America of preserving a significant, substantial strategic presence in East Asia in the face of China's power, in the face, for that matter, of India's power, is going to be very high. And I think the imperatives for America to do that are not going to be that high. I think when I speak to Americans, I get the sense that if they can't dominate in the region as they used to do, they're more likely to simply withdraw and leave it to Asia to work out how to manage our strategic affairs. And again, we can see a parallel here with what's happening in Europe, where I think America is in effect saying to the Europeans, that the Europeans themselves should manage the strategic order in their part of the world without the United States playing a significant role. I think it's likely that the US approach to Asia will evolve in the same way. In my book about how to defend Australia, my 2019 book, How to Defend Australia, what I sought to do was to ask if Australia finds itself living in an Asia in which the United States is no longer playing a significant role, which I think is the most likely future we face, then how should we think about defending ourselves? Because throughout our history, we've depended on our great and powerful friends, first Britain, then America, to really guarantee our security. And so the question for Australia is it faces a future in which those outside powers no longer play a significant role in Asia and therefore can't play a significant role in defending us. We have to ask ourselves, how do we defend ourselves? Now, many people in Australia have argued that Australia can't defend itself, that our population is too small, our continent is too big, the challenges are too vast. I think that's wrong, and what I sought to do in that book was to set out how Australia should think about its security, what kind of defence approach it should take, and what kind of forces it might have to build to do that. And I think I think the arguments I made then are still correct. I think the book is basically still a good blueprint for Australia's defence in this coming era. The point I made in my Sleepwalk to War quarterly essay was that, particularly under the Biden administration, as the Biden administration, you remember Joe Biden 4 times said that America would go to war to defend Taiwan if it was attacked. Now, that seemed to me to be a very dangerous proposition to make because I don't believe the United States could win a war with China over Taiwan, and I don't believe that it would be at all sensible for America to go to war with China for that reason. Now, I think there's a very significant issue for Australia there because the closeness of our alliance with the United States and the way in which our political leaders were at that stage, identifying Australia very, very closely with US policy, particularly through initiatives like the Orcus submarine program, did raise a very clear assumption, expectation, that if the US found itself going to war with China over an issue like Taiwan, then Australia would join. Now, I think that's a question which is now less clear. I think Australian doubts about supporting the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, have grown significantly. And so I think that is a less significant risk now than it used to be. Nonetheless, I do think Australia still faces a very big challenge to rethink our approach to our role in Asia, our relations in the region, and indeed our relations with China, in the face of this shift that we're talking about from a region in which the United States has played a very strong or even dominant role on the one hand, to a region in which my expectation is the United States will not play a very significant role in the decades to come. And I think that transition is one that we're still very much trying to work our way through. I think the shift from the Trump to the Trump administration from the Biden administration and the fact that Trump has been re-elected for a second term is a very significant development. I think it shows that some of the policies and ideas that underlie the MAGA movement, the Trump movement, are not just anomalies in US politics. I think they reflect some very deep and fundamental shifts in the way America thinks of itself and thinks of its role in the world. And I think that's very significant for the US, of course, but it's also very significant for US allies. And I do think that at the heart of Trump's policy approach is a return to isolationism. I do think fundamentally that Trump does not think that the United States should commit itself to defending allies in remote parts of the world, like in East Asia or in Europe. And I think that runs very deep in Trump's whole approach. And so I think that is compelling Australians to think more carefully about the extent to which we should presuppose that the United States will be there to support us, and that Australia's approach to dealing with the fundamental strategic shifts underway in Asia at the moment should be simply to support US policy, whatever happens. So I think there's a really, the election of the second Trump administration, the way the second Trump administration has conducted itself since its inauguration back in January, is a fundamental new element in our thinking. On the other hand, I also think that the deeper trends which are driving the future of America's role in Asia, the future of the evolution of strategic affairs in Asia, and therefore Australia's approach to the region, I think those are even bigger than Trump. So I think even if Trump hadn't been elected, even if we'd had another Democrat administration under Kamala Harris, for example, I think the long-term shift for America to move away from playing the kind of dominant role that it used to play in Asia towards withdrawal from the region, I think those long-term trends are already deeply established. For example, Joe Biden, as we mentioned before, talked a lot about America's determination to help defend Taiwan if it was attacked, but he did nothing substantial to increase America's military capacity in the region to prevail in such a war. And I therefore think that, following the principle that you should pay attention to what people do rather than to what they say, I think even under Biden, the move from the United States away from a really robust strategic posture in Asia towards a trajectory in which it essentially moves out of the region, I think that was already well underway. So I think Trump is very significant, but in a sense, his moves are really in some ways reflecting the longer term trends that were present under Biden, and for that matter, going all the way back to Obama and George W. Bush. I think the long pattern of America's response to China's astonishing rise over the last 25, 30 years has been to step back implicitly by failing to take the kinds of steps that would be necessary to preserve its strength in Asia in the face of China's growing power. Now, what that means for Australia, very simply, is that we have to move away from presuming that, if I can put it this way, America can solve our problems for us. I think the tendency in Australia, the assumption was that if China challenged the US leadership in Asia, the United States would push back and would effectively contain China's challenge. And what we needed to do was, if we wanted to continue to live in an Asia which was dominated by the United States, which we did, all we needed to do was to support the United States, and the United States would make it all work for us. Now, I think what Australia needs to do is to get over that illusion. We have to recognise that whether we like it or not, we are going to live in an Asia in which Asian powers like China, like India, for that matter, like Indonesia, are going to be the primary players in this part of the world. The United States is not going to play a very significant role. By supporting the United States in its talk about confronting and containing China, we won't succeed in seeing the United States remain the dominant power. We'll simply make it harder to manage the transition to that new Asia that we're heading into, whether we like it or not. Yes, I do think AUKUS was a big mistake for Australia, and I think it's done nothing to strengthen our strategic position. I have really two kinds of criticisms of AUKUS as a policy. On the one hand, AUKUS was an approach to acquiring submarines. You know, right at the heart of AUKUS was the idea that Australia should replace its present conventionally powered submarines with diesel-powered submarines supplied by the United States and the United Kingdom. I think that was a bad policy decision on Australia's part, because I think we don't need nuclear-powered submarines. They don't meet Australia's strategic and operational needs. And I also don't think we're going to get them. I think the plan for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS was very flawed as an acquisition strategy, and I think the chances of them actually being delivered to us are very low. So I think on that front, AUKUS was a bad idea and has done nothing to support Australia's security. I think on the other hand, though, AUKUS was also a kind of a very potent symbolic expression of Australia's commitment to support Washington in Washington's approach to pushing back against China. Now, I think that was a mistake as well, because, as we've discussed, I think Washington has not been serious about pushing back against China. I think it's talked, at least under the Biden administration, it talked a lot about that, but it failed to take the big steps that would have been necessary to really put America in a position to counteract China's growing power and to preserve the US place in the region as its leading power. So I think it made the mistake of aligning Australia with a US approach to China, which was mistaken in its own conception and which was unlikely to succeed. And I therefore think, to the extent that AUKUS was very much seen, both in Canberra and in Washington, as a very strong reaffirmation and reinforcement of Australia's alignment with US policy, because I think that US policy has been mistaken and flawed, I think it was a bad thing for Australia to do. I therefore think AUKUS has been a big mistake. And I think at the moment it's under something of a cloud, because people in Washington are, I think, for very good reasons from Washington's own point of view, reviewing AUKUS with a view to seeing whether it really suits America's interests either. I do think, observing China's rise has been one of the great constants of my career. I first started observing these things in about 1980, so really just at the time when Deng Xiaoping started the process which has produced modern China. And for a very long time now, I've felt that the rise of China was the most significant strategic event in my lifetime, and I think that's proved to be the case, and that it would fundamentally transform Asia's strategic affairs and Australia's place in the region and Australia's strategic affairs. I think that's proved to be the case. It's always seemed to me to be that we in the West have continually underestimated China. We've continually been surprised by how much China has achieved, and I think there's still a bit of a tendency to underestimate China. And it's always seemed to me that China was, as its power grew, going to become more ambitious and more assertive about its role regionally and globally, not because of anything specific about China, but just because that's the way great powers always tend to behave. That's what Britain did when Britain rose to be a great power. That's what America did when America rose to be a great power. For that matter, it's what Japan did when Japan rose to be a great power. But it's also always seemed to me that how that would happen, what kind of a great power China would become, what kind of a leader in the region it would be, and what that would mean for Australia. That depended a great deal on developments in China, but also depended a great deal on how the rest of us reacted. And it's always seemed to me that one of the challenges for all of us, both countries like America from outside the region, but also those of us inside the region, is to think very carefully about what kind of role we want to play in helping to shape the kind of regional great power that China becomes. And I think that's still the great challenge we face.
In our second Thinkers Forum, we delve into one of the big questions of our era. Can socialism surpass capitalism in driving innovation? Scholar Radhika Desai challenges conventional wisdom on global developments, AI, and the myth of Silicon Valley supremacy, arguing that China's model may be leading the next technological frontier.
Historically, of course, we have a global north, global south. I don't like those terms personally, but I'll use them for now. So you have essentially the imperialist countries and the rest of the world, because there is a history. The imperialist countries have become rich by exploiting the south. And then you had a question about AI, and you pointed out that the AI technologies have until recently been developed primarily in Western countries, and now it's being developed in China. A lot of people think that countries of the third world, or the developing world, or the world majority, or the global south, whatever you want to call it, eventually they will develop in much the same way as the global north, but that is not the case. Their development must be, it has no option but to be very different from that of the global north, for a very simple reason. Because when the global north developed, it set back the development of the global south. So the global south is beginning from a point that is further back in time. Okay, so, or rather, it has been pushed back. Imagine a race in which all the contestants start from the same starting line. But instead of starting from the same starting line, the global south countries have been forced back. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that the global south countries do not have other countries to dominate, exploit, subordinate, to aid their own development. And the third is that historically, as Russia, China, most developing countries have found out, the imperialist countries, the global north, have actively resisted their development. They have tried to stop their development, whether it is through structural adjustment programs or trade wars or actual military wars and so on. So in all of these ways, the development of the global south will have to look completely different, and it will have to be a much greater, much more heroic effort. So that's the first point. The second point is, you were asking about AI, and it's funny because I've just been writing a paper which should be published very soon, how the release of the R1 model in January, the day Trump was inaugurated actually, has exposed what I call the broken Silicon Valley model of innovation. I call it, you've heard the expression sci-fi, right? Science fiction. So I call it sci-fin-fi. That is, the fiction is both about science, it's about finance, and about finance. So both innovation, science and finance are deeply corrupt in this. And this has been the Silicon Valley model. And the Silicon Valley model cannot win. And China's model will win, is winning. So what did I argue? What I argued in that is, a lot of people, including even many Marxists, believe that, socialism may be fairer, it may be more just, but capitalism, there's nothing better than capitalism when you come to the development of technology, development of the forces of production. But what DeepSeek has shown us is that actually capitalism, if it were ever good at innovation, it has now exhausted its capacity for innovation. What you have with DeepSeek is DeepSeek has shown that actually socialism is the better model, provides the better model for developing technology, for innovating, etc. Because you see, what has happened today, and it has happened before, since at least the 1990s, when you got the dot-com bubble in US stock markets, what happened is that there was a lot of hype about technology. And this hype about technology interacted with hype about the American economy and so on to create the stock market bubble. And the stock market bubble, this was encouraged by all sorts of people in authority, including Alan Greenspan, who said that, when people said, oh, there may be a bubble, he said, oh, nonsense, there is no bubble. Productivity revolution in the US economy. There is a hidden productivity miracle in the US economy. It's hidden from the statistics, but not from the stock market. These were all the lies. But the point is that this was the sort of hype that caused the stock market to rise, invest money in all these assetless companies which had produced nothing, developed nothing, and it led to, and within a few years, less than 5 years later, the whole thing crashed. And the valuations of all these companies, which had gone from zero to some absurd figures, came back to zero. And lots of people lost money. So similarly, we are observing another stock market bubble, which is based on hype. So the hype is that you have to develop AI. And in order to develop AI, you need billions and trillions of dollars of investment, which of course DeepSeek has shown that you don't need the scale of investment. They post these absurd claims about how AI is going to replace human thinking. AI will never replace human thinking. Humans create AI. AI does not create humans, This kind of hype is necessary in order to bring this kind of absurd money into the stock market. And as you know, the US stock markets are rising, but they're not all stocks are rising. Only the stocks of these so-called Magnificent Seven are rising. And the Magnificent Seven stocks are rising because of all this hype about AI. But the hype about AI has already been shown to be false. But the money still has to go somewhere. So they keep putting money into these, particularly Nvidia. But anyway, so all of this is going to crash. And the United States has not actually, people called it a Sputnik moment. But in many ways, it's worse than Sputnik. Because, when Sputnik happened, when the Soviets put a satellite into space, there was not even a NASA, right? But today, what has happened is that the DeepSeek David has defeated the Goliaths of ChatGPT and whatnot, these big American companies, after years during which everybody thought that the US was in the lead. And the US was not. They have poured billions of dollars into developing this. They are seeking billions more to develop this. Meanwhile, DeepSeek shows that, look, you can do it with a few $1 million and you don't need that many chips and you don't need that much energy. This is real innovation.
And that's it for this edition of China Now. Thank you for joining us. I am Stanley Kwabla Arku. Now be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments and stay with us for more in our next episode. Thanks for watching.